Okay. So yesterday we began a section of Shmone Perakim that took his instruction about virtue to another, we'll call it another level. First, he talked about virtues and maybe talked about some of the specific ones. And we talked about how the middle road is where good virtues lie. They're not typically on either extreme. There might be an exception or two, but for the most part, if you saw behavior as a continuum, so let's say on one side you had a spendthrift and on the other side you had a miser, so it's that place in between that is where the good virtue lies. And he said that we have a responsibility to develop good virtue for several reasons. One is that if you have good character, we'll go back to character, virtues and character. If you have good character, that will support and advise your behavior and inspire your behavior. And it's important to have correct behavior. We know it's important to have correct behavior, that the Torah wants us to act in a particular way, and we need to follow through and act in that way. If you have good character, you're able to do it, but also because the ultimate highest goal of achievement for mankind is to know God, and there's degrees of knowing God. So in order to be able to know God and to reach the highest degrees of knowledge of God, your virtues need to support you, because otherwise they get in the way and you don't have an opportunity to reach the fulfillment of your potential. So, and he even, talked about it even a little bit more in depth. Again, even if somebody really did seem to be acting correctly, but their character wasn't perfected, this is still an issue. He said even the philosophers and Mishlei and Proverbs are in agreement, and that if you compare a person, they both have, as far as actions are concerned, they're at the same place, but one of them has a refined character and the other one doesn't. In other words, the one who doesn't has been working with discipline in order to get himself to do it. His character doesn't necessarily support it. He's still good. He still did. They've acted exactly the same between the two of them. And he said the philosophers argue that they're close. They're very close, but that there's a preference to the person whose character supports his actions, as opposed to the person who has to really work in spite of his character to do those things. But then he suggested that even that it makes enough of a difference that a person, even at when they're at the highest level of behavior, that they still focus on developing character. And again, I can't stress enough that sometimes working on your character is doing something that is otherwise removed from service of God. In other words, it's not a mitzvah per se. It's not studying Torah. You're not fulfilling any other mitzvah except that you're working on your character, which is going to, again, support and refine your behavior. So if part of, and included in working on your character might be exercise. So it may mean, as I was presenting before, let's say at a time when they thought, maybe they still do, that being in the shvits helps to maintain good health. So then being in the shvits, because we're supposed to maintain good health so that we can behave properly, so that we can reach our goals. Being in the shvits is a fulfillment of working on good health, but it's not a mitzvah per se, and it's not there's no connection to learning Torah, because you're not allowed to learn Torah in the shvits. We'll call it a preparation for mitzvah, something like a hechsher mitzvah, because it's allowing you to do the mitzvahs that you need to do, even if it per se is not necessary. Now, you could say, it does say in the Torah, Ushmartem ma'odas nafshosechem, and you shall watch over your spirit, your life force, so that, and I know there are people who say there's no such thing as something that's not a mitzvah or an avera. If you're doing it to serve God, then it's a mitzvah. If you're doing something to serve your desires, then it's an avera. But technically speaking, these things fall into another area. So it would be with character. Let's say a person, like we said before, a person has trouble spending money. So their work on their character would be to spend money on things they wouldn't otherwise spend it on. So let's say they're buying their food, so regularly they only buy like meager food, like day-old bread and stuff about to spoil. And now they're being trained to. So the Rambam said, in order to be trained, you have to go like to the complete other side, in order to get back to the middle. So now this person might be asked to buy the finest cuts of steak and kosher caviar and fine wines and dine on the richest, most expensive food in order to get themselves back to that place. So they're doing it to work on their character, but what they're doing, again, doesn't seem like spiritual work. For people that are devoted to spiritual work all day long, they typically are involved in things connected to Torah study or mitzvahs or davening, and that's all that's taking up their time. So to be told that you need to have a meal that is going to be with steak and fine wine and everything else, that you need to do this as part of your service, this would be a real challenge for somebody who is working towards what saintly behavior and the richest fulfillment of their path. But this seems to be what the Rambam is saying, and the fact that it's a challenge, big deal. That's what you should expect if you want to become saintly. Then it should be a big deal. It should be hard for you to do it. But this is what the kind of thing we're talking about, where they're really being asked to work almost counterintuitively and spend time on it. Because if you don't fix this, you think you're studying all day and you're doing mitzvahs all day and you're davening all day, and somehow that is going to lead to the deepest connection with God. But I'm telling you, if you don't work on that miserliness, you're not getting there. You're not getting there. So therefore, this lavish meal that you're going to have every night is, in some ways, might get you there in a way that's more profound and deep, even than the davening and the learning and whatever else that you're doing, because the stuff, these character traits are holding you back. So that was something that he had established up until now. This is now a new level, but also very much related to character and why it is you need to work on character. So I'm going to share screen at this point. So we're going to start again at this place. Concerning the barrier between God and man and its signification. Many passages are found in the Midrash, the Agadah, and the Talmud, which state that some of the prophets beheld God from behind many barriers, and some from behind only a few, according to the proximity of the prophet to him, to God, and the degree of his prophetic power. Consequently, The rabbi said that Moses, our teacher, saw God from behind a single clear, that is transparent partition. As they express it, he, Moshe, looked through a translucent specularia. Specularia is the name of a mirror made of transparent body like crystal or glass, and is explained at the end of tractate, as is explained at the end of tractate Kalim, which is part of the purity and impurities teachings. Let me now explain the above statement. In accordance with what we have made clear in chapter 2, virtues are either intellectual or moral. Similarly, vices are intellectual, as ignorance, stupidity, and want of understanding, or they are moral, as inordinate lust, pride, irascibility, anger, impudence, avarice, and many other similar defects, a list of which we have given and explained in chapter 4. Each of these defects is as a partition separating man from God, the Most High. This is what the prophet meant when he said, "But your iniquities have ever made a separation between you and your God," which means that our sins, which, as we have said, are the evil qualities, are the partitions which separate us from God. So again, imagine that you're looking through glass and you are being asked to describe what you see. So there are, if it's let's say it's dark inside the room where you are and it's bright outside. So when you're looking through the glass, and let's say you're looking at the glass from some distance. So you're looking at the glass from some distance through the glass. It's very possible you can't even tell there is a glass there. Everything on the outside is crisp and clear to you, and you may not even notice the glass. What if outside is dark and inside there's light, and you're standing relatively close to the glass? At this point, you may see nothing outside. As you're looking, you're straining to see outside, you see mostly your reflection and a little bit shadows moving a little bit, but not with great definition. Those are the extremes when it comes to looking through glass. And as you move from absolute clarity to that almost impossible to see, the kind of issue that is making it difficult to see, besides the dimming of the light outside, is your own reflection. The sharper your own reflection becomes, the harder it is to see beyond it. This is one model for understanding this notion of the glass. That the glass also, I saw this somewhere. I think Ramon Shapiro even mentioned it, but I definitely saw it somewhere, that if glass is cloudy, or if it gets schmutz on it, it reflects. It reflects back on you. So the kind of schmutz on the glass could be said to be our problematic character. Somebody who's humble, whose character does not reflect on the way they see the world. So they see, as looking through a clear glass on a bright day from a dark room, they see everything absolutely clearly, because their character is not being projected on to what it is that they see. But somebody whose character gets projected on what they see, it becomes very difficult to actually see the thing for what it is, because You have to see through yourself, as it were. You have to see through a kind of reflection of yourself. Yesterday, I shared that video from Rabbi David Foreman, who was suggesting that there is another issue and again, the object of our gaze is God. As far as the Rambam is concerned, the object of our gaze is God, inasmuch as we can know him and see him and connect to him. That's our purpose. So not being able to see clearly is a failure of serious import. I mean, because ultimately that's the goal, to know God, to what we would call see clearly. I mean, not literally see, but see clearly. And so anything that would get in the way of seeing God needs to be worked on. So yesterday's video from Rabbi Foreman, where he was talking about knowing, what is knowing, and how knowing can be compromised. When he talks about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that at some point we confuse what we like with what is right. That there are moral dilemmas where we wonder what is the right thing to do, what is the correct thing to do. And you could have an intellectual discussion going back and forth about what the right thing to do is in a particular situation. But your hope is that your consideration is based on morals, not simply what you want. That your decisions about what is right and wrong is based on some kind of objective criteria, and not simply because you want what you want. The problem is that as you get more connected to objects of your desire or circumstances of your desire, it becomes more and more difficult to know when I feel something is right just because I want it to be so, or when it is right because it is right. It's almost a kind of turning on its head the Euthyphro Dilemma. There was this conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro about whether something is good because the gods want it, or do the gods want it because it is good. In other words, does the fact that God wants us to do something make it good? Or is there some kind of criteria of what is good and bad? And once something is good, God wants us to do it. Once something is bad, God doesn't want us to do this. That is a very heavy, ham-handed summation of the Euthyphro Dilemma. Is something good because the gods wanted it, or do the gods want it because it is good? And so I once saw an article where Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that Jews don't have this distinction because God is the creator of the universe, besides just an actor in it, and so they don't really have it. But we as human beings might have it. In other words, this might be part of what is confusing. When I'm trying to figure out what is right and what is wrong, am I playing God, as it were? Maybe this is a kind of consequence of eating from the tree, not so much that we are like God who knows good and bad, but we think we're God when it comes to good and bad. In other words, we think that because we want it, that makes it good. And that becomes confused with what might be actually good. Okay, anyways. Know then that no prophet received the gift of prophecy unless he possessed all the mental virtues and a great majority of the most important moral ones. So the rabbi said, prophecy rests only upon the wise, the brave, and the rich. He is quoting from Tractate Nedarim, Tractate Shabbos. Eina shchina shora el al chacham gibor va'ashir. Ubal koma. By the word wise, they undoubtedly refer to all the mental perfections. By rich, they designate the moral perfection of contentment, for they call the contented man rich. Who is rich? One who is happy with his lot. Their definition of the word rich being, who is rich? He who is contented with his lot. That is, one who is satisfied with what fortune brings him and who does not grieve on account of things that he does not possess. Likewise, brave stands for a moral perfection. That is, one who is brave guides his faculties in accordance with intelligence and reason, as we have shown in chapter 5. The rabbis say, who is brave? He who subdues his passions. It is not, however, an indispensable requirement that a prophet should possess all the moral virtues and be entirely free from every defect. For we find that scripture testifies in reference to Solomon, who was a prophet, that the Lord appeared to Solomon in Givon, although we know that he had the moral defect of lust, which is plainly evident from the fact that he took so many wives, a vice springing from the disposition of passion, which resides in the soul. It plainly says, did not Solomon sin by these things? Even David, a prophet, according to the words, to me spoke the rock of Israel, we find guilty of cruelty. And although he exercised it only against the heathens and in the direction of non-believers, being merciful towards Israel, it is explicitly stated in Chronicles that God considered him unworthy, did not permit him to build the temple, as it was not fitting in his eyes because of the many people David caused to be killed. So God said to him, thou shalt not build a house to my name, because much blood hast thou shed. We find also that Elijah gave vent to his anger, and although he did so only against unbelievers, against whom his wrath blazed up, the sages declared that God took him from this world, saying to him, he who has so much zeal as thou hast is not fit to guide men, for you'll destroy them. Likewise, we find that Shmuel feared Saul, and that Jacob was afraid to meet Esau. These and similar characteristics were so many partitions between the prophets and God. It's just interesting how he puts Yaakov in the midst of this and Shmuel for being afraid. And their fear, he is suggesting, was a character flaw that now has put layers between them and God. He of them who had 2 or 3 qualities which did not maintain the proper medium, as is explained in chapter 4, is said to have seen God from behind 2 or 3 partitions. So he seems to be suggesting that each partition is related to a particular character flaw. You may not be surprised to learn, however, you must not be surprised to learn, however, that a few moral imperfections lessen the degree of prophetic inspiration. In fact, we find that some moral vices cause prophecy to be entirely withdrawn. Thus, for instance, anger may do this. As our rabbis say, if a prophet become enraged, the spirit of prophecy departs from him. They adduce proof for this from the case of Elisha, from whom, when he became enraged, prophecy departed until his wrath was subsided, at which he exclaimed, and now bring me a musician. So he's using music to reduce his anger, because his anger is getting in the way of his prophecy. You can't have prophecy and at the same time be angry. I just want to see this.
I just want to,
Yeah.
It's, maybe a small point, but I think I mentioned it before. This is where he disagrees. He has basically an Aristotelian virtue ethics. That's what he's expounding here. Do we agree?
He says that, but he also suggests that Proverbs, that Mishlei and other places support his notion. He at one point suggested that the whole tenor of the Torah.
Yes, no, yeah, but
right, but he makes no bones about it. He said this is coming from the philosophers, and he means Aristotle.
Yeah, but he disagrees with Aristotle on one main point as far as a good character. Aristotle thought that it was an essential part of a good character to have indignation at certain times when it's righteous indignation.
Right.
The Rambam disagrees.
Right, I think he did. He did earlier. He specifically said that. Yeah.
Right. So even if you might look at this as a remedy, I'm too timid or whatever it is, or I'm too. You never get expression. You always steer away from anger.
Yeah. There's also, I don't know if he did not say it overtly. He said about anger, like he's saying over here. It might be the Ramban for sure says it, Nachmanides, that arrogance, also gaiva, arrogance is also one that you should not have. He says it in his letter to his son, that also he singles out anger and arrogance as the two really most.
This is the Ramban.
Right. Okay. Right. He singles out arrogance as well.
Yeah. But
yes, but I agree. He even said that earlier. He said that about anger earlier. That he's departing from Aristotle on that point. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that.
Because he to him, anger was the most destructive thing of it all. If you think of when you made your bad decisions, they were generally in a time of anger. You're not. It sort of causes common sense to depart.
What about Moshe destroying the tables? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't
Right,
know.
but there has to be over there some kind of evidence that God supported it. Otherwise, people would point to it as a problem, I think.
Yes. By the way,
Yeah.
Rabbi, is Maimonides using prophet in the most general sense, because Jacob doesn't prophesy? Do you know what I mean? Just the connection with God. All these people are not kind of prophets we think of.
He seems to. He argues that if somebody speaks to God, if God speaks to somebody, that makes you a prophet.
Okay. All right.
That's the basic definition. Then there's in fact, that you remember that we had that hierarchy from Eight Shalom, from Rabbi Eight Shalom. There was a hierarchy of prophecy, or he called it like 10 different types of prophets. I don't know if he necessarily said it was a hierarchy. And he started with this definition, which he said is the Rambam's definition. If God speaks to you, you're a prophet. But then he goes on to talk about prophets that are asked to do things. And then there's prophets who are on mission representing God. And then there's prophets who act out things in front of people. Then there's prophets who speak, that the power of their prophecy is speaking. So that there could be all different types, but it seems like at least the Rambam bare bones definition, if God talks to you, you're a prophet, which gets him into trouble, because even here, he had already said, in order to be a prophet, all your mental faculties, have to be like impeccable, sort of. your mental virtues, and clearly that's not the case with every prophet.
Look at Saul. I mean,
right. He was he may not have had prophecy during his depression, but he may have at least had the faculty. But if you look at certain other people who God seems to be talking to, like Yiftach and Gidon, they don't. I mean, I'm not saying they were complete idiots, but they don't seem to have had like impeccable intellect, the way he's describing that they have like a kind of perfection of intellect. And yet they are clearly prophets, and anybody who he is suggesting, anybody who God speaks to is a prophet. Just interesting. Yeah. So you see Jacob, I mean, he gets full-blown prophecy anyways. Yaakov has some really serious prophecies that are mentioned in the Torah, the latter vision, etc. Those are, he may not be the one speaking, but the material of the prophecy itself is amongst our great literature, you could say. The sages moreover say the spirit of prophecy rests not upon the idle, nor upon the sad, but upon the joyous. When Moshe, our teacher, discovered that there remained no partition between himself and God, which he had not removed, and when he had attained perfection by acquiring every possible moral and mental virtue, he sought to comprehend God in his true reality, since there seemed no longer to be any hindrance thereto. He therefore implored God, show me, I beseech you, thy glory. But God informed him that this was impossible, as his intellect, since he was a human being, was still influenced by matter. That's how he explains it. He explains when God said, a person cannot see me and live, he's explaining that to mean because you are still made of matter. So God's answer was, for no man can see me and live. Thus there remained between Moses and his comprehension of the true essence of God only one transparent obstruction, which was his human intellect still resident in matter. God, which now he's also suggesting, that's why, and live. In other words, after, it could be that after death, we would be able to see with more clarity than we can see in life. This is something, by the way, the Kuzari, when he talks about this, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari, he suggests that prophecy, there's no gain in death when it comes to a relationship with God, that everything that is available to the human being after death is available to the human being in life. And he points to prophecy, that prophecy is this connection between man and God. And it is a connection that is every bit as close as any connection you could have afterwards. It sounds like from the Rambam that he doesn't agree with that. It could be even Rabbi Yehuda Halevi doesn't have to mean that you have it exactly the same. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi could mean that you have it to some degree, but it sounded like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari was suggesting that there's no advantage to death when it comes to a relationship with God, that you can have every bit as much a relationship with God in life that you can after death. But here it sounds just the very fact that we're material, which we are in life, but we are not in death. That is some kind of hindrance to our potential connection with God. Okay, we'll pause here.